Why dogs bark. Have you ever wondered why dogs bark at you? Most of you would think they don't know you yet, or you did something to them, right? Wrong. They're not barking at you. They're barking at what they see behind you, or in front of you, or beside you, maybe even above you. By the time you're around them more, they get used to seeing it. But you'd think they got used to you. No. They are so used to seeing that tall, winged, skinny, pale creature, it's all they see after a while. The creature's main target is animals such as cats or dogs. It stays by humans because that's the one thing the animal sees every day. But humans aren't safe either. The creature is easily angered, so if the dog barks or attacks it, the creature hurts the human. That's also why dogs and cats attack you, because they're scared. You may ask why I know all this, right? Well, I can see things others can't, such as this creature. I can see where they are at every moment, anywhere. And I can tell that there is one beside you, watching you, breathing on your neck, rubbing its bony fingers through your delicate hair. Don't bother looking around for it. You won't find it. You'll just have to learn to live with it. A Dog is a Man's Best Friend by serial killer T. Swift. I was only 7 years old when my mom died, but I remember that night like it was yesterday. Maybe part of it is being here in my childhood bedroom again, seeing the same worn wooden beam stretching across the ceiling, hearing the same aches and creaks as the old house settles in, smelling the same faint smell of old dust and new paint. It all brings me right back to my childhood. I'm going to try to explain this as quickly as I can because, honestly, I'm scared. And I need help or advice, or maybe I just need someone else to know. I don't know. I'm back in my childhood home for the first time in nearly 16 years. After my mom died, my dad and I moved away, but apparently he never sold the house. He passed away last month after a long battle with prostate cancer, and I take comfort in the fact that he's finally able to be with my mom again. He never remarried, and I think he missed her until the day he died. I didn't know the house was still in his name until I got a call from the executor of his will, who told me the house was now mine. Apparently it's just been empty this whole time. He never sold it and never even rented it out. But he kept up with regular maintenance, even keeping the lawn and the garden perfectly manicured. Honestly, the house is just as I remember it as a kid. Long story short, I ended up moving in. It's way too big a house for just me and my dog Noodle, but something in me won't let me sell it despite of all my friends telling me I should. It's stupid, I know. The place is a 45-minute drive from the city where I work, but my dad kept it for all those years, and I feel like just getting rid of it would somehow be disrespecting his memory. Back to 2001, the night my mom died. I can remember waking up in the early morning hours, a silver of crescent moon still high in the sky. Just like now, I lay bundled up under a pile of blankets and quilts. And just like now, my dog was in the room with me. Only he wasn't sleeping either. Instead, he was staring at himself in the mirror. I should note that this was not unusual at all for this dog. May he rest in peaceful doggy heaven. Toby was always a bit of an oddball, and we'd often find him just sitting around staring at himself in the mirror. He'd sit contently for hours, wagging his tail in the mirror as if the sight of his own face was the most wonderful thing in the world. That night, however, it immediately put me on edge. For the past week leading up to that night, Toby had started to act weird when he looked at himself in the mirror. His normally happy-go-lucky demeanor would shift, and he'd start to let out a low growl. He'd woken me up with this little act several times in a row, and it was starting to give me the creeps. This particular night, it was even worse. Toby wasn't just looking in the mirror, not even just growling. He was staring into that thing with a primal intensity I'd never seen before. His hackles were raised, his short fur standing up all along his spine, and he was low to the ground, poised in what looked like a position of half threat and half fear. I was about to quietly call out to him when he suddenly started snarling, baring his teeth in a show of aggression unlike anything I'd ever seen from my normally sweet and gentle childhood dog. That's when my mom started to scream. Her bedroom was just across the hallway, and with my door cracked open, I could hear her loud, high-pitched shrieks as if she were standing right next to me. I was just a kid at the time, but I'll always regret what I did next. I just hid. I knew that I was the only one in the house. My dad was deployed in Afghanistan at the time, and to this day, I don't know why, but I didn't get up. Didn't try to help. Didn't even get up to call 911. My dog barking and my mom screaming, and all I did was get under my covers and hide. Even when the screaming stopped, I stayed hidden. Even when the sun rose, I stayed hidden. In fact, it wasn't until mid-morning when the cops came for a welfare check that they were able to coax me out of my bed. My dad came home early. He never explained to me what happened to my mom. Even in later years when I asked, he would just say he didn't want to talk about it. For all I knew, she was just gone. The funeral was a week later, and we were out of the house within a month. So that brings me to now. I've been in this house for a couple of weeks now, and God, I hope this doesn't sound paranoid or stupid, but my dog Noodle has started acting weird. She started spending a bunch of time staring in the mirror, just like Toby used to. Only before coming to this house, she never had this habit. At first, I just thought it was kind of funny, but she's been doing it more and more. For the past few nights, I've woken up in the middle of the night to find her staring into the mirror and quietly growling, and it's getting more and more aggressive. What prompted me to post this is how she's acting tonight. I can tell she's on edge. She's pacing in front of the mirror, snarling, her hair standing on end. And I noticed something. The angle of the mirror is such that when you're standing right in front of it, the reflection must point right at my open bedroom door. My dog isn't staring at herself. She's staring at whatever's right outside my door. I'm in the bed right now, and from the position in the room, I can't see out into the hallway. So far, I haven't been able to bring myself to get up and check it out, but I think that's what I have to do. God, I'm scared. Ghost dog. I used to be a 911 operator. Working graveyard shift, you get a lot of bogus calls. Seems like all the crazies come out at night. Well, one night, it was different. An elderly woman called in about some noise in her downstairs area at about midnight. She said it sounded like someone or something was running wildly through the house, tearing it up, knocking over furniture. So, as it's protocol, we can't take any call lightly. 2 officers were dispatched to check out the disturbance. Upon arrival, they found that there was nothing out of place, knocked over, broken, or otherwise missing. There were also no signs of forced entry. The officers in question took down her information and just wrote it off as an isolated incident. All of us thought nothing else of it. The next night, Same call, same time, but her speech pattern was a bit off when compared to the previous night. Like she saw what was tearing up her downstairs. In the middle of her sentence, she was abruptly interrupted by a blood-curdling scream. Officers were immediately dispatched. Upon arrival, they found the woman deceased in her kitchen. She had bite marks all over her body, and it appears as if her throat had been ripped out. The officers requested backup as well as animal control, as there may be multiple suspects or an animal on the loose. The officers split up and checked every room in the house. One officer went downstairs and checked every square inch of the basement. There was one door at the back of the basement that was locked. He called for assistance to get the door unlocked. Once unlocked, they checked inside the small room only to find the remains of a dog. The rate of decomposition showed that the dog had been dead for well over 15 years. Upon further investigation, it was revealed that the various bite marks all over the woman's body, as well as the wound on her throat, were all caused by a dog. I found it all to be a bit coincidental. I took it upon myself to check dental records from the dog remains we found and compare them to the wounds on the woman's body. They were an exact match. I resigned the following day and haven't left my house in over a month. Every now and again, I hear scratching at my door late at night. Around the same time I got the final call from her. I dare not check what is out there, for fear that I'll end up the same way.
An old man and his dog stand together looking across the open water. They live in a small coastal town in Alaska. The news reported that the old man's son had drowned while they were out fishing. It was a fluke accident, the reporter had said. There was nothing more anyone could do. The old man and the dog glanced at each other, then back at the water. They knew better. It had been a dark, foggy night as the old man and his son Thomas had been out fishing. They always brought their dog Crichton, who loved to be out on the boat. The two men were enjoying a beer when the dog started to growl. "What is it, boy?" Thomas asked. In an instant, something huge had latched onto Thomas's arm. He fell back into the water. His father jumped in after him to no avail. The dog and the old man were forced to watch as the dark thing took his son, pulling him down deep into the water. That had been 1 week ago. An accident? No. Though it was dark, the man had made out two distinct yellow eyes. He swore the thing had smiled back at him as it pulled his son farther and farther into the darkness. A week later, having hardly left his home, the old man filled up the dog's food and water bowls on the porch. He locked the front door of his little house and put the key in the mail. Walking down to the dock, the old man was lost in thought. He held back tears as he knew he would never see his son again. He would never get to talk with him, never hear him laugh. The monster had taken all that away. Boarding the 30-foot sailboat, the dog quickly jumped on before the old man could push the boat off from shore. "Where do you think you're going?" The dog looked back up at him and towards the open water. "I don't think we're gonna make it back, boy." Seeing what looked like determination in the dog's eyes, the old man nodded. The dog had left his son too. Armed only with an old spear gun and a knife his son had given him, he had decided to kill whatever had taken Thomas. They motored into the night, 1 week exactly from the day his son had died. Same time of night, Same foggy conditions. I figure it was sometime around midnight, the old man said, turning the old wooden wheel of the boat and scanning the fog. Maybe it hunts at midnight. The dog stood silently near the wheel, not leaving the old man's side. It wasn't until 2 a.m. that the creature finally showed itself. It peeked its head up from under the water. Though it was 100 yards out, 2 large yellow eyes stood out in the darkness of the water. The dog growled fiercely as the old man grabbed the spear gun and stared at the creature. They locked eyes. The monster slowly moved farther out, not in fear, but beckoning the old man and the dog to follow. And they did. It led them out miles from shore into the beginnings of a storm. Watching Crichton pace back and forth, the old man watched the creature in the water ahead of them. I know what it's doing, boy. It don't matter. We ain't coming back, but that thing ain't either. We're gonna kill it. For Thomas. As the sailboat was now fully in the storm, the hull shook violently with each new wave. The 2 of them took cover below and kept watch through the small windows as they waited. Suddenly, the monster appeared. It broke the glass of the window and slashed its claws into the flesh of the old man's shoulder. The spear gun dropped from his hands and slid across the floor. Barking furiously, the dog lunged at the monster and bit down. Screaming in pain, the thing leapt away from the shattered window. They could hear it moving around them to the other side of the boat. Dark red blood poured from the man's shoulder. I'm alright. Let's kill it, boy. He grabbed the spear gun and opened the hatch as they went outside cautiously into the storm. The rain was blinding, and they could barely see. Where is it, boy? Seeing something rush towards him, the old man fired the gun quickly and struck the monster. Even at 72, he was a hell of a shot. As he bent down to reload the gun, the creature came at him again. It hit the old man full force in the chest, knocking him back and sinking its razor-sharp teeth into him again and again. Then a scream of surprise and rage echoed through the downpour. The creature felt the strong jaws of the dog lock on the back of its neck. Its claws flailed wildly, raking the dog's side. But the dog never faltered. He stood with his paws on the thing's back and bit down hard. There was a snapping sound, and the creature lay still. But its eyes were still aware, and as it lay, unable to move, it watched the old man and the dog with a rage and pure hatred. You shouldn't have taken my son. Staring back at the monster, the old man found the handle of his knife and plunged it deep into the creature's skull. With a shudder, its raspy breath stopped. It was finally dead. They had killed it. Sitting back down to rest for a moment, the old man struggled to stand. He dragged the creature's limp carcass to the back of the boat, pulled it up and over the side, and let it go. The old man and the dog watched as it slid, lifeless, into the sea. As the 2 of them sat together on the boat one last time, the old man rested his hand on the dog's head. Good boy. He pulled out his flare gun and shot it once, far into the sky. I'm sorry, boy. You stay here. Though the sky was beginning to clear, the lingering wind still shook the boat from side to side. The dog watched as the old man closed his eyes. His head fell to his chest, and he slid peacefully into the sea. Almost jumping in after him, The dog quietly whined and paced back and forth. The old man had told him to stay. Sometime later, the Coast Guard pulled up next to the boat. They found only a large German Shepherd, covered in blood, looking down into the water. And that's how it came to be, that an old man and a dog killed the monster. I first met in person with Mary E. in the summer of 2007. I had arranged with her husband of 15 years, Terrence, to see her for an interview. Mary had initially agreed, since I was not a newsman but rather an amateur writer gathering information for a few early college assignments, and if all went according to plan, some pieces of fiction. We scheduled the interview for a particular weekend when I was in Chicago on unrelated business, but at the last moment Mary changed her mind and locked herself in the couple's bedroom, refusing to meet with me. For half an hour I sat with Terrence as we camped outside the bathroom door, I listening and taking notes while he attempted fruitlessly to calm his wife. The things Mary said made little sense but fit with the pattern I was expecting. Though I could not see her, I could tell from her voice that she was crying, and more often than not, her objections to speaking with me centered around an incoherent diatribe on her dreams, her nightmares. Terrence apologized profusely when we ceased the exercise, and I did my best to take it in stride. Recall that I wasn't a reporter in search of a story, but merely a curious young man in search of information. Besides, I thought at the time I could perhaps find another, similar case if I put my mind and resources to it. Mary E. was the system operator for a small Chicago-based bulletin board system in 1992 when she first encountered smile.jpg, and her life changed forever. She and Terrence had been married for only 5 months. Mary was one of an estimated 400 people who saw the image when it was posted as a hyperlink on the BBS, though she is the only one who has spoken openly about the experience. The rest have remained anonymous, or are perhaps dead. In 2005, when I was only in 10th grade, smile.jpg was first brought to my attention by the burgeoning interest in web-based phenomenon. Mary was the most often cited victim of what is sometimes referred to as smile dog. The being smile.jpg is reputed to display. What caught my interest, other than the obvious macabre elements of the cyber legend and my proclivity towards such things, was the sheer lack of information, usually to the point that people don't believe it even exists other than as a rumor or hoax. It is unique because though the entire phenomenon centers on a picture file, that file is nowhere to be found on the internet. Certainly many photo-manipulated simulacra litter the web, showing up with the most frequency on sites such as the image board 4chan, particularly the LXL-focused paranormal subboard. It is suspected these are fakes because they do not have the effect the true smile.jpg is believed to have, namely sudden onset temporal lobe epilepsy and acute anxiety. The purported reaction in the viewer is one of the reasons the phantom-like smile JPEG is regarded with such disdain, since it is patently absurd. Though depending on whom you ask, the reluctance to acknowledge smile.jpg's existence might be just as much out of fear as it is out of disbelief. Neither smile.jpg nor smile.dog is mentioned anywhere on Wikipedia. Any attempt to create a page pertaining to smile.jpg is deleted by any of the encyclopedia's many admins. Encounters with smile.jpg are the stuff of internet legend. Mary E's story is not unique. There are unverified rumors of smile.jpg showing up in the early days of Usenet, and even one persistent tale that in 2002 a hacker flooded the forums of humor and satire website Something Awful with a deluge of smile.dog pictures, rendering almost half the forum's users at the time epileptic. It is also said that in the mid to late 90s that smile.jpg circulated on Usenet and as an attachment of a chain email with the subject line, "Smile, God loves you." Yet despite the huge exposure these stunts would generate, there are very few people who admit to having experienced any of them, and no trace of the file or any link has ever been discovered. Those who claim to have seen smile.jpg often weakly joke that they were far too busy to save a copy of the picture to their hard drive. However, all alleged victims offer the same description of the photo. A dog-like creature, usually described as appearing similar to a Siberian husky, illuminated by the flash of the camera, sits in a dim room. The only background detail that is visible being a human hand extending from the darkness, near the left side of the frame. The hand is empty, but is usually described as beckoning. Of course, most attention is given to the dog, or dog creature, as some victims are more certain than others about what they claim to have seen. The muzzle of the beast is reputedly split in a wide grin, revealing 2 rows of very white, very straight, very sharp, very human-looking teeth. This is, of course, not a description given immediately after viewing the picture, but rather a recollection of victims, who claim to have seen the picture endlessly repeated in their mind's eye during the time they are, in reality, having epileptic fits. These fits are reported to continue indeterminably, often while the victims sleep, resulting in very vivid and disturbing nightmares. These may be treated with medication, some being more effective than others. Mary E., I assumed, was not on effective medication. That was why, after my visit to her apartment in 2007, I sent out feelers to several folklore and urban legend-oriented news groups, websites, and mailing lists, hoping to find the name of a supposed victim of smile.jpg who felt more interested in talking about his experiences. For a time, nothing happened, and at length I forgot completely about my pursuits, since I had begun my freshman year of college and was quite busy. Mary contacted me via email, however, near the beginning of March 2008. This is Mary's email. Dear Mr. L, I am incredibly sorry about my behavior last summer when you came to interview me. I hope you understand that it was no fault of yours, but rather my own problems that led me to act out as I did. I realized that I could have handled the situation more decorously. However, I hope you will forgive me. At the time, I was afraid. You see, for 15 years I have been haunted by smile.jpg. Smile Dog comes to me in my sleep every night. I know that sounds silly, but it's true. There is an ineffable quality about my dreams, my nightmares, that makes them completely unlike any real dreams I have ever had. I don't move and I don't speak. I simply look ahead, and the only thing ahead of me is the scene from that horrible picture. I see the beckoning hand, and I see Smile Dog. It talks to me. It is not a dog, of course, though I am not quite sure what it really is. It tells me it will leave me alone if only I do as it asks. All I must do, it says, is spread the word. That is how it phrases its demands. And I know exactly what it means. It wants me to show it to someone else. And I could. The week after my incident, I received in the mail a manila envelope with no return address. Inside was only a 3.5-inch floppy disk. Without having to check, I knew precisely what was on it. I thought for a long time about my options. I could show it to a stranger, a coworker. I could even show it to Terrence, as much as the idea disgusted me. And what would happen then? Well, if Smile Dog kept its word, I could sleep. Yet if it lied, what would it do? And who was to say something worse would not come for me if I did as the creature asked? So I did nothing for 15 years, though I kept the diskette hidden amongst my things. Every night for 15 years, Smile Dog has come to me in my sleep and demanded that I spread the word. For 15 years I have stood strong, though there have been hard times. Many of my fellow victims on the BBS board where I first encountered Smile.jpg stopped posting. I heard some of them committed suicide. Others remained completely silent, simply disappearing off the face of the web. They're the ones I worry about the most. I sincerely hope you will forgive me, Mr. L. But last summer when you contacted me and my husband about an interview, I was near the breaking point. I decided I was going to give you the floppy disk. I didn't care if Smile Dog was lying or not. I wanted it to end. You were a stranger, someone I had no connection with, and I thought I wouldn't feel sorrow when you took the disk as part of your research and sealed your fate. Before you arrived, I realized what I was doing. I was plotting to ruin your life. I couldn't stand the thought, and in fact, I still cannot. I am ashamed, Mr. L, and I hope that this warning will dissuade you from farther investigation of Smile.jpg. You may in time encounter someone who is, if not weaker than I, then wholly more depraved. Someone who will not hesitate to follow Smile Dog's orders. Stop while you are still whole. Sincerely, Mary L. Terrence contacted me later that month with the news that his wife had killed herself. While cleaning up the various things she'd left behind, closing email accounts and the like, he happened upon the above message. He was a man in shambles. He wept as he told me to listen to his wife's advice. He'd found the disc, he revealed, and burned it until it was nothing but a stinking pile of blackened plastic. The part that most disturbed him, however, was how the disc had hissed as it melted, like some sort of animal, he said. I will admit that I was a little uncertain about how to respond to this. At first I thought perhaps it was a joke, with a couple belatedly playing with the situation in order to get a rise out of me. A quick check of several Chicago newspapers' online obituaries, however, proved that Mary E. was indeed dead. There was, of course, no mention of suicide in the article. I decided that for a time at least, I would not farther pursue the subject of Smile.jpg, especially since I had finals coming up at the end of May. But the world has odd ways of testing us. Almost a year after I'd returned from my disastrous interview with Mary E., I received another email. Hello. I found your email address through a mailing list. Your profile said you were interested in Smile Dog. I have seen it, and it isn't as bad as everyone says. I have sent it to you here. Just spreading the word. That final line chilled me to the bone. According to my email client, there was only one file attachment, called Naturally, Smile.jpg. I considered downloading it for some time. It was most likely a fake, I imagine. And even if it weren't, I was never wholly convinced of Smile.jpg's peculiar powers. Mary E's account had shaken me, yes, but she was probably mentally unbalanced anyway. After all, how could a simple image do what Smile.jpg was said to accomplish? What sort of creature was it that could break one's mind with only the power of the eye? And if such things were patently absurd, then why did the legend exist at all? If I downloaded the image, if I looked at it, and if Mary turned out to be correct, if Smile Dog came to me in my dreams, demanding I spread the word, what would I do? Would I live my life as Mary had, fighting against the urge to give in until I died? Or would I simply spread the word, eager to be put to rest? And if I chose the latter route, how could I do it? Whom would I burden in turn? If I went through with my earlier intention to write a short article about Smile.jpg, I decided I could attach it as evidence. And anyone who read the article, anyone who took interest, would be affected. And even assuming the Smile.jpg attached to the email was genuine, would I be capricious enough to save myself in that manner? Could I spread the word? Yes. Yes, I could. Jack London. To build a fire. He was quick and alert in the things of life, but only in the things, and not in the significances. Day had broken cold and gray, exceedingly cold and gray, when the man turned aside from the main Yukon Trail and climbed the high earth bank, where a dim and little-traveled trail led eastward through the fat spruce timberland. It was a steep bank, and he paused for breath at the top, excusing the act to himself by looking at his watch. It was 9 o'clock. There was no sun nor hint of sun, though there was not a cloud in the sky. It was a clear day, and yet there seemed an intangible pall over the face of things, a subtle gloom that made the day dark, and that was due to the absence of sun. This fact did not worry the man. He was used to the lack of sun. It had been days since he had seen the sun, and he knew that a few more days must pass before that cheerful orb, due south, would just peep above the skyline and dip immediately from view. The man flung a look back along the way he had come. The Yukon lay a mile wide and hidden under 3 feet of ice. On top of this ice were as many feet of snow. It was all pure white, rolling in gentle undulations where the ice jams of the freeze-up had formed. North and south, as far as his eye could see, it was unbroken white, save for the dark hairline that curved and twisted from around the spruce-covered island to the south, and that curved and twisted away into the north, where it disappeared behind another spruce-covered island. This dark hairline was the trail, the main trail, that led south 500 miles to the Chilkoot Pass and still on to the north 1,000 miles to Nalado, and finally to St. Michael on Bering Sea, 1,000 miles and half 1,000 more. But all this mysterious far-reaching hairline trail, the absence of sun from the sky, the tremendous cold, and the strangeness and weirdness of it all made no impression on the man. It was not because he was long used to it. He was a newcomer in the land, a Chachiquo, and this was his first winter. The trouble with him was that he was without imagination. He was quick and alert in the things of life, but only in the things and not in the significances. 50 degrees below zero meant 80-odd degrees of frost. Such fact impressed him as being cold and uncomfortable, and that was all. It did not lead him to meditate upon his frailty in general, able only to live within certain narrow limits of heat and cold, and from there on it did not lead him to the conjectural field of immortality and man's place in the universe. 50 degrees below zero stood for a bite of frost that hurt and that must be guarded by the use of mittens, ear flaps, warm moccasins, and thick socks. 50 degrees below zero was to him just precisely 50 degrees below zero. That there should be anything more to it than that was a thought that never entered his head. As he turned to go, he spat speculatively. There was a sharp, explosive crackle that startled him. He spat again, and again in the air before it could fall to the snow. The spittle cracked. He knew that at 50 below, spittle cracked on the snow, but this spittle had cracked in the air. Undoubtedly, it was colder than 50 below. How much colder, he did not know. But the temperature did not matter. He was bound for the old claim on the left fork of Henderson Creek, where the boys were already. They had come over across the divide from the Indian Creek country, while he had come the roundabout way to take a look at the possibility of getting out logs in the spring from the islands and the Yukon. He would be in the camp by 6 o'clock, a bit after dark, it was true, but the boys would be there, a fire would be going, and a hot supper would be ready. As for lunch, he pressed his head against the protruding bundle under his jacket. It was also under his shirt, wrapped in a handkerchief and lying against the naked skin. It was the only way to keep the biscuits from freezing. He smiled agreeably to himself as he thought of those biscuits, each cut open and sopped in bacon grease, and each enclosing a generous slice of fried bacon. He plunged in among the big spruce trees. The trail was faint. A foot of snow had fallen since the last sled had passed over, and he was glad he was without a sled, traveling light. In fact, he carried nothing but the lunch wrapped in the handkerchief. He was surprised, however, at the cold. It certainly was cold, he concluded, as he rubbed his numb nose and cheekbones with his mittened hand. He was a warm-whiskered man, but the hair on his face did not protect the high cheekbones and the eager nose that thrust itself aggressively into the frosty air. At the man's heels trotted a dog, a big native husky, the proper wolf dog, gray-coated and without any visible or temperamental difference from its brother, the wild wolf. The animal was depressed by the tremendous cold. It knew that it was no time for traveling. Its instinct told it a truer tale than was told to the man by the man's judgment. In reality, it was not merely colder than 50 below zero. It was colder than 60 below, than 70 below. It was 75 below zero. Since the freezing point is 32 above zero, it meant that 107 degrees of frost obtained. The dog did not know anything about thermometers. Possibly in its brain there was no sharp consciousness of a condition of very cold such as was in the man's brain, but the brute had its instinct. It experienced a vague but menacing apprehension that subdued it and made it slink along at the man's heels, and that made it question eagerly every unwanted movement of the man as if expecting him to go into camp or to seek shelter somewhere to build a fire. The dog had learned fire and it wanted fire, or else to burrow under the snow and cuddle its warmth away from the air. The frozen moisture of its breathing had settled on its fur in a fine powder of frost, and especially were its jowls, muzzle, and eyelashes whitened by its crystalled breath. The man's red beard and mustache were likewise frosted, but more solidly, the deposit taking the form of ice and increasing with every warm, moist breath he exhaled. Also, the man was chewing tobacco, and the muzzle of ice held his lips so rigidly that he was unable to clear his chin when he expelled the juice. The result was that a crystal beard of the color and solidity of amber was increasing its length on his chin. If he fell down, it would shatter itself like glass into brittle fragments, but he did not mind the appendage. It was the penalty all tobacco chewers paid in that country, and he had been out before in 2 cold snaps. They had not been so cold as this, he knew, but by the spirit thermometer at 60 Mile, he knew that they registered at 50 below and 55. He held on through the level stretch of woods for several miles, crossed a wide flat, and dropped down a bank to the frozen bed of a small stream. This was Henderson Creek, and he knew he was 10 miles from the forks. He looked at his watch. It was 10 o'clock. He was making 4 miles an hour, and he calculated that he would arrive at the forks at 12:30. He decided to celebrate that event by eating his lunch there. The dog dropped in again at his heels, with a tail drooping discouragement as the man sung along the creek bed. The furrow of the old sled trail was plainly visible, but a dozen inches of snow covered the marks of the last runners. In a month, no man had come up or down that silent creek. The man held steadily on. He was not much given to thinking, and just then particularly, he had nothing to think about save that he would eat lunch at the forks and that at 6 o'clock he would be in camp with the boys. There was nobody to talk to, and had there been, speech would have been impossible because of the ice muzzle on his mouth. So he continued monotonously to chew tobacco and to increase the length of his amber beard. Once in a while, the thought reiterated itself that it was very cold and that he had never experienced such cold. As he walked along, he rubbed his cheekbones and nose with the back of his mittened hand. He did this automatically, now and again changing hands. But rub as he would, the instant he stopped, his cheekbones went numb, and the following instant the end of his nose went numb. He was sure to frost his cheeks, he knew that, and experienced a pang of regret that he had not devised a nose strap of the sort Bud wore in cold snaps. Such a strap passed along the cheeks as well and saved them, but it didn't matter much after all. What were frosted cheeks? A bit painful, that was all. They were never serious. Empty as the man's mind was of thoughts, he was keenly observant, and he noticed the changes in the creek, the curves and bends and timber jams, and always he sharply noted where he placed his feet. Once, coming around a bend, he shied abruptly, like a startled horse, curved away from the place where he had been walking, and retreated several paces back along the trail. The creek, he knew, was frozen clear to the bottom. No creek could contain water in that Arctic winter, but he knew also that there were springs that bubbled out from the hillsides and ran along under the snow and on top the ice of the creek. He knew that the coldest snaps never froze these springs, and he knew likewise their danger. They were traps. They hid pools of water under the snow that might be 3 inches deep, or 3 feet. Sometimes a skin of ice half an inch thick covered them, and in turn was covered by the snow. Sometimes there were alternate layers of water and ice skin, so that when one broke through, he kept on breaking through for a while, sometimes wetting himself to the waist. That was why he had shied in such panic. He had felt the give under his feet and heard the crackle of a snow-hidden ice skin, and to get his feet wet in such a temperature meant trouble and danger. At the very least, it meant delay, for he would be forced to stop and build a fire, and under its protection to bare his feet while he dried his socks and moccasins. He stood and studied the creek bed and its banks, and decided that the flow of water came from the right. He reflected a while, rubbing his nose and cheeks, then skirting to the left, stepping gingerly and testing the footing for each step. Once clear of the danger, he took a fresh chew of tobacco and swung along at his 4-mile gait. In the course of the next 2 hours, he came upon several similar traps. Usually the snow above the hidden pools had a sunken, candied appearance that advertised the danger. Once again, however, he had a close call, and once, suspecting danger, he compelled the dog to go on in front. The dog did not want to go. It hung back until the man shoved it forward, and then it went quickly across the white, unbroken surface. Suddenly, it broke through, floundered to one side, and got away to firmer footing. It had wet its 4 feet and legs, and almost immediately the water that clung to it turned to ice. It made quick efforts to lick the ice off its legs, then dropped down in the snow and began to bite out the ice that had formed between the toes. This was a matter of instinct. To permit the ice to remain would mean sore feet. It did not know this. It merely obeyed the mysterious prompting that arose from the deep crypts of its being. But the man knew, having achieved a judgment on the subject, and he removed the mitten from his right hand and helped tear out the ice particles. He did not expose his fingers more than a minute, and was astonished at the swift numbness that smote them. It certainly was cold. He pulled on the mitten hastily and beat the hand savagely against his chest. At 12 o'clock, the day was at its brightest, yet the sun was too far south on its winter journey to clear the horizon. The bulge of the earth intervened between it and Henderson Creek, where the man walked under a clear sky at noon and cast no shadow. At 12:30 to the minute, he arrived at the forks of the creek. He was pleased at the speed he had made. If he kept it up, he would certainly be with the boys by 6. He unbuttoned his jacket and shirt and drew forth his lunch. The action consumed no more than a quarter of a minute, yet in that brief moment the numbness laid hold of his exposed fingers. He did not put the mitten on, but instead struck the fingers a dozen sharp smashes against his leg. Then he sat down on a snow-covered log to eat. The sting that followed upon the striking of his fingers against his leg ceased so quickly that he was startled. He had had no chance to take a bite of the biscuit. He struck the fingers repeatedly and returned them to the mitten, baring the other hand for the purpose of eating. He tried to take a mouthful, but the ice muzzle prevented. He had forgotten to build a fire and thaw out. He chuckled at his foolishness, and as he chuckled he noted that the stinging which had first come to his toes when he sat down was already passing away. He wondered whether the toes were warm or numb. He moved them inside the moccasins and decided that they were numb. He pulled the mitten on hurriedly and stood up. He was a bit frightened. He stamped up and down until the stinging returned to his feet. It certainly was cold, was his thought. That man from Sulphur Creek had spoken the truth when telling him how cold it sometimes got in the country, and he had laughed at him at the time. That showed one must not be too sure of things. There was no mistake about it. It was cold. He strode up and down, stamping his feet and threshing his arms until reassured by the returning warmth. Then he got out matches and proceeded to make a fire. From the undergrowth, where high water of the previous spring had lodged a supply of seasoned twigs, he got his firewood. Working carefully from a small beginning, he soon had a roaring fire, over which he thawed the ice from his face and in the protection of which he ate his biscuits. For the moment, the cold of space was outwitted. The dog took satisfaction in the fire, stretching out close enough for warmth and far enough away to escape being singed. When the man had finished, he filled his pipe and took his comfortable time over a smoke. Then he pulled on his mittens, settled the ear flaps of his cap firmly about his ears, and took the creek trail up the left fork. The dog was disappointed and yearned back towards the fire. The man did not know cold. Possibly all the generations of his ancestry had been ignorant of cold, of real cold, of cold 107 degrees below freezing point. But the dog knew. All its ancestry knew. and it had inherited the knowledge. And it knew that it was not good to walk about in such fearful cold. It was the time to lie snug in a hole in the snow and wait for a curtain of cloud to be drawn across the face of outer space whence this cold came. On the other hand, there was no keen intimacy between the dog and the man. The one was the toil slave of the other, and the only caresses it had ever received were the caresses of the whiplash and of harsh and menacing throat sounds that threatened the whiplash. So the dog made no effort to communicate its apprehension to the man. It was not concerned in the welfare of the man. It was for its own sake that it yearned back toward the fire. But the man whistled and spoke to it with a sound of whiplashes, and the dog swung in at the man's heels and followed after. The man took a chew of tobacco and proceeded to start a new amber beard. Also, his moist breath quickly powdered with white his mustache, eyebrows, and lashes. There did not seem to be so many springs on the left fork of the Henderson, and for half an hour the man saw no signs of any. And then it happened. At a place where there were no signs, where the soft, unbroken snow seemed to advertise solidity beneath, the man broke through. It was not deep. He wet himself halfway to the knees before he floundered out to the firm crust. He was angry and cursed his luck aloud. He had hoped to get into camp with the boys at 6 o'clock, and this would delay him an hour, for he would have to build a fire and dry out his footgear. This was imperative at that low temperature, for he knew that much, and he turned aside to the bank which he climbed. On top, tangled in the underbrush above the trunks of several small spruce trees, was a high water deposit of dry firewood, sticks and twigs principally, but also larger portions of seasoned branches and fine, dry, last year's grasses. He threw down several large pieces on top of the snow. This served for a foundation and prevented the young flame from drowning itself in the snow it otherwise would melt. The flame he got by touching a match to a small shred of birch bark that he took from his pocket. This burned even more readily than paper. Placing it on the foundation, he fed the young flame with wisps of dry grass and with the tiniest dry twigs. He worked slowly and carefully, keenly aware of the danger. Gradually, as the flame grew stronger, he increased the size of the twigs with which he fed it. He squatted in the snow, pulling the twigs out from their entanglement in the brush and feeding directly to the flame. He knew there must be no failure. When it is 75 below zero, a man must not fail in his first attempt to build a fire. That is, if his feet are wet. If his feet are dry and he fails, he can run along the trail for half a mile and restore his circulation. But the circulation of wet and freezing feet cannot be restored by running when it is 75 below. No matter how fast he runs, the wet feet will freeze the harder. All this the man knew. The old-timer on Sulphur Creek had told him about it the previous fall, and now he was appreciating the advice. Already all sensation had gone out of his feet. To build the fire he had been forced to remove his mittens, and the fingers had quickly gone numb. His pace of 4 miles an hour had kept his heart pumping blood to the surface of his body into all his extremities. But the instant he stopped, the action of the pump eased down. The cold of space smote the unprotected tip of the planet, and he, being on that unprotected tip, received the full force of the blow. The blood of his body recoiled before it. The blood was alive, like the dog, and like the dog it wanted to hide away and cover itself up from the fearful cold. So long as he walked 4 miles an hour, he pumped that blood willy-nilly to the surface. But now it ebbed away and sank down into the recesses of his body. The extremities were the first to feel its absence. His wet feet froze the faster, and his exposed fingers numbed the faster, though they had not yet begun to freeze. Nose and cheeks were already freezing, while the skin of all his body chilled as it lost its blood. But he was safe. Toes and nose and cheeks would only be touched by the frost, for the fire was beginning to burn with strength. He was feeding it with the twigs the size of his finger. In another minute, he would be able to feed it with branches the size of his wrist, and then he could remove his wet footgear, and while it dried, he could keep his naked feet warm by the fire, rubbing them at first, of course, with snow. The fire was a success. He was safe. He remembered the advice of the old-timer on Sulphur Creek and smiled. The old-timer had been very serious in laying down the law that no man must travel alone in the Klondike after 50 below. Well, here he was. He had had the accident, he was alone, and he had saved himself. Those old-timers were rather womanish, some of them, he thought. All a man had to do was to keep his head, and he was all right. Any man who was a man could travel alone. But it was surprising how rapid with which his cheeks and nose were freezing, and he had not thought his fingers could go lifeless in so short a time. Lifeless they were, for he could scarcely make them move together to grip a twig, and they seemed remote from his body and from him. When he touched a twig, he had to look and see whether or not he had hold of it. The wires were pretty well down between him and his finger ends, all of which counted for little. There was the fire, snapping and crackling and promising life with every dancing flame. He started to untie his moccasins. They were coated with ice. The thick German socks were like sheaths of iron halfway to the knees, and the moccasin strings were like rods of steel, all twisted and knotted as by some conflagration. For a moment he tugged with his numb fingers, then, realizing the folly of it, he drew his sheath knife. But before he could cut the strings, it happened. It was his own fault, or rather his mistake. He should not have built the fire under the spruce tree. He should have built it in the open. But it had been easier to pull the twigs from the brush and drop them directly on the fire. Now, the tree under which he had done this carried a weight of snow on its boughs. No wind had blown for weeks, and each bough was fully freighted. Each time he had pulled on a twig, he had communicated a slight agitation to the tree, an imperceptible agitation so far as he was concerned, but an agitation sufficient to bring about the disaster. High up in the tree, one bough capsized its load of snow. This fell on the boughs below, capsizing them. This process continued, spreading out and involving the whole tree. It grew like an avalanche, and it descended without warning upon the man and the fire was blotted out. Where it had burned was a mantle of fresh and disordered snow. The man was shocked. It was as though he had just heard his own sentence of death. For a moment he sat and stared at the spot where the fire had been. Then he grew very calm. Perhaps the old-timer on Sulphur Creek was right. If he had only had a trail made, he would have been in no danger now. The trail made could have built the fire. Well, it was up to him to build a fire over again, and this second time there must be no failure. Even if he succeeded, he would most likely lose some toes. His feet must be badly frozen by now, and there would be some time before the second fire was ready. Such were his thoughts. But he did not sit and think them. He was busy all the time they were passing through his head. He made a new foundation for a fire, this time in the open, where no treacherous tree could blot it out. Next, he gathered dry grasses and tiny twigs from the high water flotsam. He could not bring his fingers together to pull them out, but he was able to gather them by the handful. In this way, he got so many rotten twigs and bits of green moss that were undesirable, but it was the best he could do. He worked methodically, even collecting an armful of the larger branches to be used later when the fire gathered strength. And all the while, the dog sat and watched him, a certain yearning wistfulness in its eyes, for it looked upon him as the fire provider, and the fire was slow in coming. When all was ready, the man reached in his pocket for a second piece of birch bark. He knew the bark was there, and though he could not feel it with his fingers, he could hear its crisp rustling as he fumbled for it. Try as he would, he could not clutch hold of it, and all the time in his consciousness, was the knowledge that each instant his feet were freezing. This thought tended to put him in a panic, but he fought against it and kept calm. He pulled on his mittens with his teeth and thrashed his arms back and forth, beating his hands with all his might against his sides. He did this sitting down, and he stood up to do it, and all the while the dog sat in the snow, its wolf brush of a tail curled around warmly over its forefeet, its sharp wolf eyes pricked forward intently as it watched the man. And the man, as he beat and threshed with his arms and hands, felt a great surge of envy as he regarded the creature that was warm and secure in its natural covering. After a time, he was aware of the first faraway signals of sensation in his beaten fingers. The faint tingling grew stronger till it evolved into a stinging ache that was excruciating, but which the man hailed with satisfaction. He stripped the mitten from his right hand and fetched forth the birch bark. The exposed fingers were quickly going numb again. Next, he brought out his bunch of sulfur matches. But the tremendous cold had already driven the life out of his fingers. In his effort to separate one match from the others, the whole bunch fell in the snow. He tried to pick it out of the snow, but failed. The dead fingers could neither touch nor clutch. He was very careful. He drove the thought of his freezing feet and nose and cheeks out of his mind, devoting his whole soul to the matches. He watched, using the sense of vision in place of that touch, and when he saw his fingers on each side of the bunch, he closed them. That is, he willed to close them, for the wires were down, and the fingers did not obey. He pulled the mitten on the right hand and beat it fiercely against his knee. Then, with both mittened hands, he scooped the bunch of matches, along with much snow, into his lap. Yet he was no better off. After some manipulation, he managed to get the bunch between the heels of his mittened hands. In this fashion, he carried it to his mouth. The ice crackled and snapped when by a violent effort he opened his mouth. He drew the lower jaw in, curled the upper lip out of the way, and scraped the bunch with his upper teeth in order to separate a match. He succeeded in getting one, which he dropped on his lap. But he was no better off. He could not pick it up. Then he devised a way. He picked it up in his teeth and scratched it on his leg. 20 times he scratched it before succeeding in lighting it. As it flamed, he held it with his teeth to the birch bark, but the burning brimstone went up his nostrils and into his lungs, causing him to cough. The match fell into the snow and went out. The old-timer on Sulphur Creek was right, he thought in a moment of controlled despair that ensued. After 50 below, a man should travel with a partner. He beat his hands, but failed in exciting any sensation. Suddenly he bared both hands, removing the mittens with his teeth. He caught the whole bunch between the heels of his hands. His arm muscles not being frozen enabled him to press the hand heels tightly against the matches. Then he scratched the bunch along his legs. It flared into flame, 70 sulfur matches at once. There was no wind to blow them out. He kept his head to one side to escape the strangling fumes and held the blazing bundle to the birch bark. As he so held it, he became aware of sensation in his hand. His flesh was burning. He could smell it. Deep down below the surface, he could feel it. The sensation developed into pain that grew acute, and still he endured it, holding the flame of the matches clumsily to the bark that would not light readily because his own burning hands were in the way, absorbing most of the flame. At last, when he could endure no more, he jerked his hands apart. The blazing matches fell sizzling into the snow, but the birch bark was alight. He began laying dry grasses and tiniest twigs on the flame. He could not pick and choose, for he had to lift the fuel between the heels of his hands. Small pieces of rotten wood and green moss clung to the twigs, and he bit them off as well as he could with his teeth. He cherished the flame carefully and awkwardly. It meant life, and it must not perish. The withdrawal of blood from the surface of his body now made him begin to shiver, and he grew more awkward. A large piece of green moss fell squarely on the little fire. He tried to poke it with his fingers, but his shivering frame made him poke too far, and he disrupted the nucleus of the little fire, the burning grasses and tiny twigs separating and scattering. He tried to poke them together again, but in spite of the tenseness of his effort, his shivering got away with him, and the twigs were hopelessly scattered. Each twig gushed a puff of smoke and went out. The fire provider had failed. As he looked apathetically about him, his eyes chanced on the dog, sitting across the ruins of the fire from him, in the snow, making restless, hunching movements, slightly lifting one forefoot and then the other, shifting its weight back and forth on them with wistful eagerness. The sight of the dog put a wild idea into his head. He remembered the tale of a man caught in a blizzard who killed a steer and crawled inside the carcass, and so was saved. He would kill the dog and bury his hands in the warm body until the numbness went out of them. Then he could build another fire. He spoke to the dog, calling it to him, but in his voice was a strange note of fear that frightened the animal, who had never known the man to speak in such a way before. Something was the matter, and its suspicious nature sensed danger. It knew not what danger, but somewhere, somehow, in its brain arose an apprehension of the man. It flattened its ears down at the sound of the man's voice, and its restless hunching movements and liftings and shiftings of its forefeet became more pronounced. But it would not come to the man. He got on his hands and knees and crawled towards the dog. This unusual posture again excited suspicion, and the animal sidled mincingly away. The man sat up in the snow for a moment and struggled for calmness. Then he pulled on his mittens by means of his teeth and got upon his feet. He glanced down at first in order to assure himself that he was really standing up, for the absence of sensation in his feet left him unrelated to the earth. His erect posture in itself started to drive the webs of suspicion from the dog's mind, and when he spoke peremptorily, with the sound of whiplashes in his voice, the dog rendered its customary allegiance and came to him. As it came within reaching distance, the man lost his control. His arms flashed out to the dog, and he experienced genuine surprise when he discovered that his hands could not clutch, that there was neither bend nor feeling in the fingers. He had forgotten for a moment that they were frozen, and that they were freezing more and more. All this happened quickly, and before the animal could get away, he encircled its body with his arms. He sat down in the snow, and in this fashion held the dog, while it snarled and whined and struggled. But it was all he could do, hold its body encircled in his arms and sit there. He realized that he could not kill the dog. There was no way to do it. With his helpless hands, he could neither draw nor hold his sheathed knife nor throttle the animal. He released it, and it plunged wildly away, with tail between its legs and still snarling. It halted 40 feet away, surveying him curiously, with ears sharply pricked forward. The man looked down at his hands in order to locate them, and found them hanging on the ends of his arms. It struck him as curious that one should have to use his eyes in order to find out where his hands were. He began threshing his arms back and forth, beating the mittened hands against his sides. He did this for 5 minutes, violently, and his heart pumped enough blood up to the surface to put a stop to his shivering. But no sensation was aroused in his hands. He had an impression that they hung like weights on the ends of his arms, but when he tried to run the impression down, he could not find it. A certain fear of death, dull and oppressive, came to him. His fear quickly became poignant as he realized that it was no longer a mere matter of freezing his fingers and toes, or of losing his hands and feet, but that it was a matter of life and death with the chances against him. This threw him into a panic, and he turned and ran up the creek bed along the old dim trail. The dog joined in behind him and kept up with him. He ran blindly, without intention, in fear such as he had never known in his life. Slowly, as he plowed and floundered through the snow, he began to see things again. The banks of the creek, the old timber jams, the leafless aspens, and the sky. The running made him feel better. He did not shiver. Maybe if he ran on, his feet would thaw out, and anyway, if he ran far enough, he would reach camp and the boys. Without doubt, he would lose some fingers and toes and some of his face, but the boys would take care of him and save the rest of him when he got there. And at the same time, there was another thought in his mind that said he would never get to the camp and the boys, that it was too many miles away, that the freezing had too great a start on him, and that he would soon be stiff and dead. This thought he kept in the background and refused to consider. Sometimes it pushed itself forward and demanded to be heard, but he thrust it back and strove to think of other things. It struck him as curious that he could run at all on feet so frozen that he could not feel them when they struck the earth and took the weight of his body. He seemed to himself to skim along above the surface and to have no connection with the earth. Somewhere he had once seen a winged Mercury, and he wondered if Mercury felt as he felt when skimming over the earth. His theory of running until he reached camp and the boys had one flaw in it. He lacked the endurance. Several times he stumbled, and finally he tottered, crumpled up, and fell. When he tried to rise, he failed. He must sit and rest, he decided, and next time he would merely walk and keep going. As he sat and regained his breath, he noted that he was feeling quite warm and comfortable. He was not shivering, and it even seemed that a warm glow had come to his chest and trunk. And yet, when he touched his nose or cheeks, there was no sensation. Running would not thaw them out, nor would it thaw out his hands and feet. Then the thought came to him that the frozen portions of his body must be extending. He tried to keep this thought down, to think of something else. He was aware of the panicky feeling that it caused, and he was afraid of the panic. But the thought asserted itself and persisted until it produced a vision of his body totally frozen. This was too much, and he made another wild run along the trail. Once he slowed down to a walk, but the thought of the freezing extending itself made him run again. And all the time the dog ran with him at his heels. When he fell down a second time, it curled its tail over its forefeet and sat in front of him, facing him, curiously eager and intent. The warmth and security of the animal angered him, and he cursed it till it flattened down its ears appeasingly. This time the shivering came more quickly upon the man. He was losing his battle with the frost. It was creeping into his body from all sides. The thought of it drove him on, but he ran no more than 100 feet when he staggered and pitched headlong. It was his last panic. When he had recovered his breath and control, he sat up and entertained in his mind the conception of meeting death with dignity. However, the conception did not come to him in such terms. His idea of it was that he had been making a fool of himself, running around like a chicken with its head cut off. Such was the simile that occurred to him. Well, he was bound to freeze anyway, and he might as well take it decently. With this newfound peace of mind came the first glimmerings of drowsiness. A good idea, he thought, to sleep off to death. It was like taking an anesthetic. Freezing was not so bad as people thought. There were lots worse ways to die. He pictured the boys finding his body next day. Suddenly he found himself with them, coming along the trail and looking for himself. And still with them, he came around a turn in the trail and found himself lying in the snow. He did not belong with himself anymore, for even then he was out of himself, standing with the boys and looking at himself in the snow. It certainly was cold, was his thought. When he got back to the States, he could tell the folks what real cold was. He drifted on from this to a vision of the old-timer on Sulphur Creek. He could see him quite clearly, warm and comfortable and smoking a pipe. "You were right, old hoss. You were right," the man mumbled to the old-timer of Sulphur Creek. Then the man drowsed off into what seemed to him the most comfortable and satisfying sleep he had ever known. The dog sat facing and waiting. The brief day drew to a close in a long, slow twilight. There were no signs of a fire to be made, and besides, never in the dog's experience had it known a man to sit like that in the snow and make no fire. As the twilight drew on, its eager yearning for the fire mastered it, and with a great lifting and shifting of forefeet, it whined softly, then flattened out its ears down in anticipation of being chided by the man. But the man remained silent. Later, the dog whined loudly, and still later it crept close to the man and caught the scent of death. This made the animal bristle and back away. A little longer it delayed, howling under the stars that leaped and danced and shone brightly in the cold sky. Then it turned and trotted up the trail in the direction of the camp it knew. Where were the other food providers and fire providers? Beginning in early April 1986, the people in and around the little-known Chernobyl nuclear power plant began to experience a series of strange events revolving around sightings of a mysterious creature described as a large, dark, and mutated man with gigantic wings and piercing red eyes. People affected by this phenomena experienced horrific nightmares, threatening phone calls, and first-hand encounters with the winged beast which became known as the Blackbird of Chernobyl. Reports of these strange happenings continued to increase until the morning of April 26, 1986, when at 1:23 a.m., Reactor 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant suffered a catastrophic steam explosion that resulted in a fire which caused a series of additional explosions followed by a nuclear meltdown. The power plant, located near Ukraine, spewed a plume of radioactive fallout which drifted over parts of the Western Soviet Union, Eastern and Western Europe, Scandinavia, the UK, Ireland, and Eastern North America. Large areas of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia were badly contaminated, resulting in the evacuation and resettlement of over 336,000 people. The Chernobyl disaster, as the incident was dubbed, is considered the worst accident ever in the history of nuclear power. Following the meltdown and subsequent explosions and fires, Soviet helicopters were dispatched to the scene, equipped with special firefighting gear. These helicopters circled the plant, dropping clay, salt, lead, and other extinguishing chemicals onto the burning facility. Most of the fire was put out by 5 a.m., with the fire burning within Reactor 4 continuing to blaze for several hours after. The firefighters who responded were unaware of the nature of the fire, assuming that it was simply an electrical one, and received massive overdoses of radiation, leading to many of their deaths, including Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik, who died on May 9, 1986. The workers who survived the initial blast and fire, but would later die of radiation poisoning, claim to have witnessed what has been described as a large black, bird-like creature with a 20-foot wingspan gliding through the swirling plumes of irradiated smoke pouring from the reactor. No farther sightings of the Blackbird of Chernobyl were reported after the Chernobyl disaster, leaving researchers to speculate just what haunted the workers of the plant during the days leading up to the disaster. The most commonly accepted theory suggests that the Blackbird of Chernobyl may have been the same creature spotted in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, leading up to the collapse of the Silver Bridge on December 15, 1968. Investigators have suggested that the appearance of this creature is an omen of disasters to come in the area in which it shows itself. The physical description of both the Blackbird of Chernobyl and the Mothman, the creature sighted in West Virginia, are very similar, and the reports of nightmares and threatening phone calls leading up to these disasters are shared in both cases. A second, less accepted theory suggests that the Blackbird of Chernobyl was nothing more than the misidentification of the Black Stork, an endangered species endemic to southern Eurasia. The Black Stork stands nearly 3 foot tall and has a wingspan of nearly 6 feet. This theory, however, fails to take into account the menacing phone calls and the disturbing nightmares. Also, the physical description given by the majority of eyewitnesses who actually saw the Blackbird of Chernobyl does not in any way match the physical appearance of the Black Stork. Both the Blackbird of Chernobyl and the Mothman have not been sighted since their respective disasters, leaving us with many unanswered questions. All we can do is wait for the beast to show itself again and give us a chance to figure out just what it may be. Unfortunately, it would seem that for this creature to show up again, we have to anticipate some form of disaster. They put up a tall fence covered with black tarp and topped by barbed wire, surrounding Lake Colette at the center of Juniper Valley, so that no one could see what they were doing. 2 of the 3 local cop cars were stationed 24/7 at either end, one to the east and one to the west. This all went on for 3 days while some unknown official body did what needed to be done. Then overnight, the black barbed wire fence was gone, replaced with the normal chain-link variety. A few middle school kids dared Kevin Witter to apply a pair of wire cutters and sneak in. My little half-brother knew Kevin. The kid claimed to have seen unmarked vans and a bevy of sunglasses-wearing government agents with automatic weapons surrounding a team of scientists in hazmat suits, dragging the carcass of a monster out of the water. The monster had 10 legs, the skin of an alligator, and the body of a squid, or the body of a shark, or matted fur or feathers or teeth. It changed per telling, and it was all bullshit. I'm guessing Kevin Witter either chickened out before doing the deed, or else was picked up by the cops as soon as he approached the fence. At the end of 3 days, some early risers in Juniper Valley reported seeing 3 unmarked cars heading east on Skylark Road, towards the highway and the Air Force Base and the Palmdale Airport. Whatever government agency was operating behind the blockade, searching the lake, they were gone without a trace by the time the sun came up. And whatever they found, they weren't telling. The cops were clueless. All they told us townsfolk was that due to a bacterial infestation, we were not to swim in the lake until farther notice. I will never swim in that lake again, and I hope to God they killed them all. I stayed in Juniper Valley during the summer with my father. He and my stepmother loved it there, loved the isolation and the small town lifestyle. Though I would hesitate to even call Juniper Valley a town, it's an unincorporated cluster of ranch-style homes planted like a pimple among the Sierra Pelona Mountains. In the 90s, the population of Juniper Valley and the surrounding hills was 800 and change. There was 1 general store in town, 1 gas station, 1 church, and 1 dirty little inn with a bar restaurant. Anything else one would need could be found in Palmdale, a 45-minute drive east, through miles of gridded power lines and golden flatland, dotted with silos and scrap metal. The town resembles a bowl with Lake Colette at the basin, and streets and houses arranged around the edges, along the slopes of the surrounding hills. Calling Lake Colette a lake is also stretching things a little bit. It's a sag pond right on the San Andreas Fault, which cuts straight through Juniper Valley. During droughts, Lake Colette would drain to a glorified puddle, a mossy marsh of waist-high weeds. There were quite a few rainy years during my childhood. Lake Colette would remain a proper body of water then, even in the midst of a hot, dry summer. I'd look out my bedroom window at the lake, below the dim circles of light cast by the 2 street lamps on Skylark Road, pitch black like a tar pit. On moonless nights it seemed bottomless, and I felt as though it could be a kilometers deep well, a black hole. I grew up. My months in Juniper Valley became skull-crushingly boring. My dad and stepmother worked, my half-siblings attended a summer program at their school, and my friends were 70 miles away. The nearest library was almost as far, and the rabbit-eared TV picked up 3 channels: local access from Palmdale, the Bible channel, and assorted infomercials. It was my step-grandmother who told me about the Will Fell Animal Sanctuary. She went to church with a lady who ran the place, a retired park ranger named Kathy. The shelter was a nonprofit funded solely by donations with an all-volunteer staff. Kathy owned an acre of hillside land off Skylark Road, just west of town, a 15-minute walk from my father's house. I was 13 the first summer I volunteered at Willfell, and I went back every summer after. They loved me there. By they, I mean the only 2 staff members. Kathy, an earthly woman in her 60s who functioned as CEO, manager, accountant, and primary caretaker of the animals, and Jacques, a 27-year-old autistic man who cleaned cages and walked dogs as part of a government-subsidized program. And I fell in love with the animals. There were about 60 of them, homeless dogs and unwanted cats. There were 2 huge kennels in Kathy's large backyard built by her sons, one for dogs and one for cats. Farther back, rabbit hutches, and at the far end, against the sturdy fence, a tiny stable that housed an elderly racehorse and a fat little donkey. When Pounds and Palmdale and Lancaster received animals they had no room for, they'd give them to Kathy. She'd drive her rickety old windowless van east to the highway, then come back hours later with new furry charges. Sometimes she'd even function as a poor man's dog catcher. Agencies would direct her towards residences from Juniper Valley to Acton, asking her to remove starving, nearly hairless dogs from gardens and pull emaciated cats out from under cars. These were the highway strays, abandoned on the 14 by individuals who no longer wished to be pet owners. That first summer, I met Jane. Jane was a friend of Kathy's, a retired Navy nurse who worked as an at-home caregiver and took in homeless cats. She visited Wilfell at least once a week, sometimes bringing large bags of cat food. Jane was a rough lady, tanned, sinewy, wrinkly beyond her years, only ever seen wearing stained wife-beaters and baggy fatigues. She never married, had no family I knew of, and seemed to prefer the company of cats to humans. Kathy considered her an asset. She'd take in 20 cats at a time, accepting responsibility when we had no more room. She owned a half-acre a few miles southwest of town, off a shabby 2-lane road called Oak Tree Lane. Oak Tree Lane snakes between gray-green hills before dead-ending deep in the Angeles National Forest. Rusting mailboxes stick out of the ground like flags at the head of dirt roads, leading to remote ranches and groves and campgrounds. Jane's cottage was at the end of one of these dirt roads, in a little clearing carpeted with knee-high weeds and prickly shrubs, surrounded on 3 sides by gently sloping hills. She'd take me there sometimes. There were always cats everywhere. Cats inside and out, cats on the sofa, cats sitting atop Jane's washer, cats sunning themselves, stalking field mice and butterflies. I'd spend hours at Jane's house with her cats, helping her clean up and clean litter boxes, cuddling kittens from the occasional litter. Jane liked me. Since she obviously felt little need for human companionship, I took this as the highest of compliments. Every summer on the first day I'd see her, Jane would break out into the biggest, brightest smile that Kathy swore she reserved only for me. "You're like me, Matthew," Jane would say, as I stared out the window of her 1979 El Camino. "You can cut through anyone's bullshit and see their soul. That's why you love animals so much. Your standards for souls are higher than most." The earthquake hit the winter of my junior year. I remember waking in the middle of the night, roused by the thud of my precariously placed math book falling off my desk. The mild shaking lasted about 3.5 seconds, then I realized I'd experienced an earthquake. My dad, his family, and Juniper Valley were hit a bit harder. Positioned on the San Andreas Fault and close to the remote epicenter, structural damage was rather extensive. The mess had been cleared up by summer, but I noticed broken sandbag barricades and new violent cracks along Skylark Road. Lake Colette looked more robust than I'd ever seen it, but was surrounded by a chain-link fence. The water had taken on a greenish tinge and hosted islands of thick yellowish scum. For now, it was closed to the public. Kathy's windowless van still hadn't broken down, but she was tired of driving it all over the valley, so she handed me the keys. I enjoyed it at first, rambling through Golden Plains until I saw the boxy developments of Palmdale, rescuing filthy, unloved creatures from the clutches of abusive owners or uncaring bureaucracy. Jane had all but disappeared. Her last nursing charge had passed away, and she was rarely seen in town. Only at the general store, Kathy told me, and very rarely. I think Kathy and I were the only people in Juniper Valley who noticed her absence. I missed Jane. I missed the way her face lit up when she saw me, and the warm summer afternoon spent in her backyard. I called her landline once; it had been disconnected. Soon, the cats started appearing. My third day back, I was sitting in Kathy's office when I received a phone call from a talkative old lady in town. There was a cat in her backyard. It had been sitting in a lower branch of her oak tree for hours. "I think it's someone's pet," she said. "It's too chubby to be a stray." This, in and of itself, was not an extraordinary event. Everyone in town knew Kathy ran a shelter and would infrequently call her in lieu of animal control when an unknown animal became a bother. Sometimes said animal would be a neighbor's lost pet. Other times a runaway that had wandered from Palmdale. Kathy always made an effort to find the owner. Rarely a feral, abandoned highway stray would make it to Juniper Valley. These poor creatures were always half-dead things with matted fur and exposed, dotted skin. They usually had to be euthanized, or died before the local vet got the chance. At first, I assumed the calm, well-groomed gray and white shorthair I found in the old lady's oak tree was the former, a townie's escaped house cat. I tried to coax the thing down with a can of tuna. No dice. It wasn't remotely interested in the food. It just stared. Black, depthless eyes locked on something that wasn't me. I stood, tuna can in outstretched hand, looking like an idiot, for 5 frustrating minutes before giving up and going to the van to grab Kathy's net. When I got back, the cat was gone. I never saw it again. It bothered me all night. It was like the cat had been messing with me. And it happened again and again. Homeowner after homeowner of Juniper Valley calling Wilfell and asking us to remove a cat from their property. Always cats. Always different cats. I don't think I ever saw the same one twice. The homeowner always insisted he or she had never seen the animal before, and they never had collars. They always appeared well fed, if not overfed. Their fur, though not show quality, was thick and intact. It became troubling. Juniper Valley had a population of 842. It was located 45 minutes from the nearest town and surrounded on 3 sides by hills and forest. Everyone knew everyone else's pets, and the sudden appearance of so many unaccounted for cats was mysterious to say the least. And these cats were not like any cats I'd ever seen before. They liked fresh water. I'd find them sitting in fountains and kiddie pools. They didn't seem to like the sun. They'd come out at night or else be found in some shaded, dark, enclosed space. They were silent, never hissing or meowing. They were really, really good at getting in and out of places. I found one curled up in the back of a lady's car. Though she admitted she'd left the door unlocked, the physical act of opening and closing the door should have been impossible for a creature with only paws at its disposal. They were smart. Supernaturally smart. At times, I fell under the disturbing impression the cat was taunting me. I'd be setting up some trap or extending the net. The cat would sit there, calm and cool, watching intently. There'd be a minute in which I'd have some semblance of hope I'd finally catch the thing this time, and then the cat would dart out of my grasp, or vanish the moment I turned my back. The weirdest part was, once or twice, the cat stopped before running off and looked at me. I could swear it was laughing. And they all shared the same icy, emotionless black eyes. I wished they didn't remind me so much of the empty eyes staring from the euthanized corpses I saw at Wilfell. Finally, I caught one. It was early July. I was quite pleased with my cunning. I bought one of those huge plastic storage tubs from the general store, filled it with water, stuck it in the back of the van, and waited for my feline quarry. A large pug-faced tabby this time. After an hour of hiding in the cab, the cat climbed down from the roof where I'd found it and into the waiting reservoir. I raced to the back, slammed the van doors, donned leather gloves, and prepared for a hissing, clawing fight. But surprisingly, the cat didn't struggle at all. It was fully submerged in the water, curled up on the bottom of the container like a rock. I picked it up, shoved it in a cage, dumped out the water, and drove. It wasn't until I was halfway to Wilfell that I noticed the smell. Once, my 9-year-old son dropped a fish stick in the back of my car and forgot about it. A humid summer week later, my car smelled just like that cat had. When we got there, the chubby cat put up about as much of a fight as it had in the van. I didn't hold it for long. Years of experience with scared animals taught me that the less time spent with claws inches from my face, the better. But the short span of time the cat was in my hands was enough to make me seriously uncomfortable. It was heavy and somehow doughy. My hands sunk into its flesh like silly putty, and it was cold. I left the cat in the quarantine cage in Kathy's office. We usually only use the cage for animals that were obviously ill, which the tabby was not. But there was just something wrong with this cat, like it shouldn't be mixed with others of its species. I gave it bowls of kibble and water, then sat down at the desk to fill out an application for a grant. Kathy was gone for the weekend visiting her sister in Bakersfield. Jacques was in the back cleaning out the pony stall. I couldn't concentrate, not with that cat there. I looked over my shoulder every other minute. Each time I'd see the same thing, the flat-faced tabby, sitting in its water bowl, staring at me. It never blinked. It never moved. It didn't even appear to breathe. The rotting, fishy odor filled the room. Finally, I cracked. I double-checked the latch on the cat's cage, locked the office door, and pretended to be busy feeding the dogs. I called the vet and asked if he could come by and take a look at the feline, but he said he wouldn't be able to for another week. The next morning, I found the office window wide open, the quarantine cage open, and the cat gone. I wasn't disappointed. Not long after that, everyone started talking about little Charlie Henderson. Charlie was 12 and had been skateboarding alone shortly before midnight in the parking lot by Lake Colette. The lake was still scum-covered and fenced off, and the occupants of the nearest homes had long since packed it in for the night. The way he told it, Charlie had been approached by a cat. He bent over to pet it, and the cat danced away, leading him to a grove of trees behind the lake. He followed the cat. Then, suddenly, he was attacked by a small army of cats. They jumped from the trees and emerged from the shadows, latching onto his clothing and limbs and dragging him towards a hole in the fence. If a lost car hadn't pulled into the parking lot and turned around, causing the cats to scatter and giving him time to run away, well, who knows what they'd have done with him. No one believed him, of course. Everyone assumed he'd been attacked by maybe one feral cat and his imagination had taken over. Because cats don't corner people and jump them. That takes organization and planning, intelligence not possessed by house pets. And his story got weird, too. He claimed one of the cats had stretched itself like silly putty and grew an opposable thumb. Then Jane came back. It was a cloudy afternoon, and I was taking advantage of the slight cool down to deep clean the dog kennel. Kathy was gone again, in Riverside watching her granddaughter play softball. I was busy scraping dried dog crap off the concrete when Jacques ran out to tell me there was a lady asking for me. I wiped off my hands and went inside to find Jane staring at me from Kathy's living room. Jane had never been obsessive about her appearance, but if I hadn't known her so well, I would have assumed the gaunt, trembling figure in a stained wife-beater was a homeless woman. Her hair was a frizzy, matted mess of gray. Her arms and chest were striped with lacerations of varying degrees of depth, in various stages of healing. And her eyes, which had once seemed to serve as a window to a rational, calculating mind, now allowed a glimpse into bloodshot insanity. "Jane," I said, "are you okay?" She didn't smile. "Do you have any?" she asked. I frowned. "Any what?" "Cats, Matthew," was the curt reply. "It's the cats. I need the cats. They've been wandering." I gave her what I hoped was a kind smile. "Okay, Jane, I can show you the cats. But Kathy said I'm not allowed to have any of them adopted without her around." That was a lie, but I wasn't about to pass Jane custody of a pet rock, let alone a living, breathing creature. She was obviously not in the physical, emotional, or mental state to care for anything. not even herself. I walked her out to the cat kennel. As expected, a small herd of dogs ran towards Jane to sniff her and beg for attention. Then, about 3 feet from her, the dogs stopped. They sniffed the air, whined, and ran off in all directions. Not a single one of them got nearer. Jane looked over the cat seriously, then sighed in disappointment. She shook her head, turned around, and paced back to Kathy's house. "You haven't caught any?" she said. "What are you talking about?" I asked. She glared, looking through me. She could cut through anyone's bullshit and see their soul. "You know what I mean, Matthew. My cats. Call me if you catch one. There's so many of them now, and they're getting bigger." With that, she walked out the door. She stopped and turned around. "And Matthew, watch the lake." I spent the rest of the day in a daze. I'd been wondering where the weird cats came from. They didn't belong to anyone in Juniper Valley, and it was hard to believe that they'd all migrated from Palmdale. Jane took in homeless cats. Maybe they were hers. I didn't know why they would have left food, water, and shelter to wander for miles along an isolated road and into a neighborhood, but it was at least a possibility. That night, following a tangled motivation I couldn't put into words, I borrowed my father's car and drove to the parking lot by Lake Colette, where Charlie Henderson had been attacked. I pulled right up to the fence, turned off my car, let my eyes adjust to the darkness. I obeyed Jane. I watched the lake. I hadn't sat for 10 minutes before I saw movement. A black shape, creeping out of the shadows and approaching the water's edge. More movement against the clump of trees to my right. Cautiously, quietly, I opened the car door and stepped out. I shut the door gently and tiptoed towards the fence. A large black cat waded in the dirty lake. Its paws were inundated. It kept on going. I came closer until I was grasping the metal links of the fence, and I felt it quiver under my fingers. I looked to my right and saw them. 2 more cats. Huge cats. The biggest I'd ever seen. Cats climbing down the fence like monkeys. Head first, completely vertical. One, then the other, jumped gracefully to the ground and stepped into the feeble light bleeding from the 2 streetlights. One was yellow, the other a tabby. The first cat was almost completely submerged. With the lightest gurgle, it ducked under the scum-covered waterline into the black hole. The light wasn't good at all. It looked as though the second and third cats had flattened when they hit the ground, like Play-Doh thrown at a wall. And there was something about how they moved. They jiggled. Their legs bent the wrong way. Or maybe it was just the shitty lighting. Where was the black cat? It couldn't still be underwater. Ripples in the lake. Small islands of yellow scum shifted in gentle waves. I didn't feel a breeze. There was something else in there. A cadence of nerves was triggered in my brain, forgotten but immediately recognizable like a song. I was scared of Lake Colette, scared like I had been as a child, when the black water had seemed from my bedroom window a bottomless well. I ran to my car. I did a donut in the parking lot and sped home. The next morning was hot and bright, and under the cloudless sky it all seemed ridiculous. I was letting the Charlie Henderson rumors get to me. I walked past Lake Colette on my way to Willfell. I went right up to the fence. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, no cats in sight. A light breeze ruffled the water. I breathed in and gagged. It smelled like rotting fish mixed with a McDonald's dumpster. It smelled like the pug-faced tabby I'd caught. Cats don't like water. Cats don't swim. I'd spent nearly half a decade surrounded by cats, and the cats I'd been chasing around yards and spying on the night before weren't cats. That smell, the way the tabby I'd caught had felt when I held it, bloated and putty-like, cold Those cats didn't purr or meow. They didn't eat. Their intelligence and that stare, those glassy, corpse-like eyes that seemed to take in everything and nothing. And Jane, her cats, she'd said, they've been wandering. They're getting bigger. Maybe she was going nuts living out there all alone in the wilds, a mile away from her nearest human neighbor. The dogs wouldn't come near her. Her own cats had been attacking her, apparently. How else to explain the scratches all over? Yet, still, she was desperate to have them back. I had to talk to Jane again. Kathy was still gone and it was Jacques' day off, so I planned on heading to Jane's lonely dirt road as soon as I fed the animals. But a couple from Palmdale called unexpectedly, asking if they could come by with their daughter to pick out a pet. By the time they'd selected a corgi mix and made arrangements to have the dog neutered, it was after 5. It was fine, it was still light out. I locked up, grabbed the keys to the van, and made my way into the hills. My teenage bravado waned as I traveled farther and farther away from Juniper Valley. There's no defined town line, but when you reach the intersection of Skylark and Oak Tree Lane, you're essentially watching civilization shrink in your rearview mirror. I'd forgotten just how far away Jane's shack was from anything, and just how desolate and lonely the mountain road became. I didn't see a single other car the whole time. Finally, I came to the rusted blue mailbox with Jane's numbers on the side. I turned on the dirt road. When I reached the apex, I saw Jane's shack. Carefully, foot on the brake, I made my way down into the valley. It didn't look like Jane was home. There was no light coming from the windows. I pulled up closer into the driveway, past the house, to the carport in the back. The back door was wide open, and Jane's El Camino was there. The cats weren't. No cats lounging in piles by the stairs. None prowling around the yard. I pulled behind Jane's car, climbed out of the van, strolled into the backyard. Jane's empty property looked lovely in approaching dusk. Beautiful trees reaching for the heavens, majestic firs meeting fluffy white clouds like an Old West movie backdrop. She must have been hiding in the house. She must have crept up behind me, because I don't remember feeling the blow. I woke up lying in cool, moist dirt. I was looking at water. Lake Colette? No, I saw nothing but hills and foliage in the distance. Where the hell was I? I sat up. My head spun. I felt blood in my hair. I was sitting on the bank of a small pond. The water was greenish and thick with algae, covered in thick yellow scum. I took a breath and lurched. The smell. Rotting fish. Rotting flesh. Fast food dumpster. Stronger than I'd ever smelled it before. The water moved. Something was emerging a few feet in front of me, swimming to shore. A black cat, paddling with uncomfortable, almost human strokes. I scrambled backwards away from the approaching creature. It reached land and pulled itself onto the bank. It stood up. The black cat's weight shifted. Its belly bulged, its lower legs swelled, became shorter and fatter. The effect was the same as squeezing a stress ball. Instead of a creature with a skeleton and tendons and muscles, I was being approached by a thing with the consistency of jelly wearing a furry suit. I screamed and stumbled to my feet. Then I felt icy fingers curl around my neck. I struggled and instinctively horse-kicked my unseen attacker. The hand loosened and I whirled around. I was face to face with Jane, but it wasn't Jane. Her face was round and flat, boneless. The wrinkles under her eyes had smoothed themselves out, and her nose bulged like a mushroom. And her eyes, the maniacal glint was gone from her eyes. So was the consciousness. So was the recognition. So was the vitality. Her pupils were so dilated her irises were no longer visible. and what had been white was now completely red. Her eyes didn't move. They were those of a corpse. Then something in the water grabbed my hand. Something cold and soft and rubber-like, slimy but very, very strong. It pulled me. It was pulling me into the water. Jane stood over me, smiling. She bent down, hands outstretched, pudgy, bloated hands attached to rope-like arms that jiggled and curled and changed shape. What happened next is a blur. I remember clawing, kicking, and screaming at the top of my lungs. And then I was running, stumbling, lungs burning, stinging, aching, cursing the spongy, weeded ground that gave under my feet. I pushed through dry shrubs and jumped over tree branches, praying I was going in a direction that would lead me to humanity, and that the crinkling of grass behind me was only my imagination. Then I was on top of the hill, looking down at Jane's shack. And then I was in Jane's yard. I saw the van and jumped in the driver's seat, silently thanking the guardian angel that distracted me so I'd left my keys in the ignition. I slammed the door. I looked up, out the windshield, and into the red and black empty eyes of the thing that had been Jane. It was smiling. She always reserved a special smile for me. I turned the key and gunned it. The van jerked violently. I slammed on the brakes, kicking up dirt like smoke. I felt a sticky moisture against my cheeks. I took a breath and barely managed to pull open the door before I projectile vomited. Even thinking about that acidic, rotting seafood stench induces a nauseous tickle in the back of my throat. I'd crushed Jane under the front right tire. She'd popped. The van still ran. I drove it straight to the police station. In the parking lot, I surveyed the damage. The front bumper was dented and a headlight was out. There was no blood. The mangled metal was splattered with glossy, opaque white goo. I was almost completely honest with the sleepy-eyed desk cop. I said that Jane tried to drown me in the hills behind her home, chased me to the van, and then I ran her over. But I left out the part where her body had taken on the properties of pasta and silly putty. The cop asked sarcastically if I'd been doing any drugs, but radioed a car to the site. Over the next week, I was questioned multiple times by the police. Their questions became increasingly bizarre, to the point where they were asking about toxic chemicals and lights in the sky, seriously, and whether I was or had ever been involved with a heavy metal band or a cult. This was the late 90s. I was chastised for driving down a lonely back road alone to approach a crazy woman, but I was never charged with a crime. The cops were cagey, but they'd found something. By the next morning, Oak Tree Lane was blocked off by the county sheriffs, and the inhabitants of the hills had been roughly evacuated with no explanation. Then came more sheriffs, then the unmarked cars, then the tall, black, barbed wire fence around Lake Colette. Jane's death was reported as a freak accident. I tried to forget. I holed up in my room watching happy movies on VHS until my mom came to take me back home. I went back to school. I threw myself into studying and applying for college. When I needed to, I snuck my mom's sleeping pills. Eventually, however, curiosity overwhelmed my fear. I wanted answers, so I elected to spend the following summer, my last before college, in Juniper Valley with my father. Wilfell was no more. Kathy had left the animals with a larger no-kill shelter in Acton, retired and moved to Riverside. There was a large for sale sign in front of what had once been her home, and it had been a dry winter. The chain-link fence, broken and bent, still surrounded Lake Colette, but the lake was little more than a puddle. I got a job waiting tables at a bar restaurant. I spent my nights serving burgers to bored townies, trying to strike up conversations about the strange events of the previous summer, the shadowy agents, the fence, the crazy cat lady. I was offered nothing but rumors, speculation, and good old-fashioned lies. Finally, I met a man named Aaron. He was in his 20s, chubby, and socially awkward. He worked as a counselor at a camp for disabled children. He talked about Dungeons and Dragons a little bit too much, and his uncle was a local cop. It was a slow night. I shot the shit with Aaron for a while. When I asked him if he'd heard about the crazy cat lady who died last year, he played it off like a tabloid headline. But I'd noticed his eyes widen and his hands tremble. I guess I got lucky. Aaron's cop uncle apparently had a weakness for Jack Daniels and a tendency to ignore police confidentiality when drunk. And that weakness must have been genetic, because an hour later, Aaron was singing like a canary. The night Jane had tried to kill me, 2 cops had been dispatched to her home off Oak Tree Lane, expecting to find an empty bottle of Everclear and a discarded bag of shrooms. Instead, they found what had been Jane. Pieces of her were scattered across the ground like debris. They radioed for backup, and a small posse spent the remainder of the night on a scavenger hunt for vital organs. They found skin. Plenty of skin. The piece that once covered her back was folded in a torn white tank top. Her bones and organs seemed strangely melted, as though pulled from a vat of acid, or digested. It was like, one officer had said, Jane had been skinned from the inside, then filled with acidic goo like a water balloon. Everything was coated in a white, translucent jelly substance. The officers had taken a sample to be tested, but by the next morning it had evaporated into a powdery white stain. The big guns were called in. Sheriffs, agents from multiple government divisions, he couldn't say who exactly. The local cops had been pushed out of the investigation by that point. He had heard that upon searching Jane's property, they found an axe, multiple firearms, boxes of ammo, and 10 cat skins buried 1.5 feet deep in the backyard, mostly with their heads detached, and all coated in the familiar white powder. They scoured the hills behind Jane's property, and they found the pond. The small pond that, according to land surveying reports, had not existed before the earthquake and the rains of the previous winter. They drained it. At the bottom, they found 24 more cat skins. The insides were all gone, yet the skins were unmarred. At no point had they been cut apart or sewn together. Again, it appeared as if something had eaten or dissolved all the blood, bones, and vital organs, except for the teeth and the eyeballs. The eyeballs were left intact to stare hauntingly into oblivion. After the discovery, they dragged Lake Colette as well. Aaron didn't know what they'd found there. The citizens of Juniper Valley were urged to stay away. It's been nearly 20 years. I'm a veterinarian now. I've done some digging, spent hours in quarters of the internet where I've seen things I can't unsee, and made some new friends. But I still don't have answers. I don't know what changed Jane's cats that summer. Were they infected? Possessed? I think it was something in the water. Hyper-intelligent, blob-like things that had been dormant for years, brought to the surface by that earthquake. But this is all conjecture, my opinion. All those years ago, I told Aaron, the chubby camp counselor, everything. He listened, eyes widening but never doubting. The next morning, he and I took his car down Oak Tree Lane to the rustling blue mailbox, and finally the abandoned shack where I'd passed so many summer days. We hiked a mile into the hills, carrying 2 shovels and my father's rifle. We found the hole that had once been a pond, now a weeded ditch. We got to work. It was hard work. It was dirty work. It took a few trips, but by the end of August, we had leveled the land and completely filled the hole with dirt. I don't know what was down there, but if there's more, they're not getting out. Ever wondered if things can just be born evil? In this enlightened age of ours, concepts like good and evil are often painted as outmoded, archaic even. According to modern thought, people, animals too obviously, are simple products of their environment and no more responsible for their actions than a twig in a stream. But I know better. Some things are just born bad. About 10 years ago, we had a German Shepherd named Duchess that had a litter of puppies, 7 in all. 6 looked like any other shepherd you've ever seen. The 7th was a snowy white. Not a true albino, just white-furred with a black nose and blue eyes. There was never any doubt about which one we were keeping out of that litter. We named her Princess. Before the end of 6 months, any plans we had about giving away or selling the others became a moot point, as all of the others were dead. We'd just find them at a rate of about 1 a month, not mangled or anything, just dead as if they died in their sleep. At first, we thought maybe their mother, it being her first litter and all, was accidentally crushing or smothering them. Later, we had no doubt as to what had killed them. Within a year, she came to dominate her mother, her father, tough old alpha that he was, and to a degree, us too. Her parents shied away from her. When we put out their food, she ate to her heart's content, unchallenged by the other two. Once I tried to shoo her away and let the other two eat. She snarled at me, baring those perfect white fangs to her black gums, and loosing a growl so deep that I felt it in my guts more than heard it. After that, I left her alone too. I've often wondered if the parents of serial killers know that they have a monster in the making. I mean, sure, some of them are to blame for how their kids turn out. Products of messed up households with systematic abuse of all possible flavors. But then there are the ones that seem to be true aberrations. It's those families I'm curious about. Do they smile and laugh and pretend that everything's fine? I know that we sure did. We downplayed the weirdness around Princess, tried to rationalize her behavior, the bizarre things she'd do, like killing rabbits and leaving them hung up in the bushes behind our home. Some dogs do that to show they love you. Cats too, my father would say. To them, it's just bringing you food. To me, it's like she was taunting us. Just like the puppies years earlier, not one of those rabbits ever had a mark on them. Princess, just like her mom and dad, was well looked after and never hurt for a meal, so it wasn't as if she was hunting for food. Her innumerable kills were always untouched. No, the only thing I ever saw her eat was a kitten. We had some feral cats in the woods around our house, and one mama cat had a litter in our tool shed. I returned home from school one day and headed around back to look in on them. The door to the shed was open, and inside I found Princess, her jaws pink from her feast. As she devoured that last kitten, her beautiful blue eyes never left mine. The mama we found displayed on what I'd come to think of as the rabbit bush. The tipping point came that same year when we found her sire dead. He was the best dog we'd ever had, that we ever will have. We woke one Saturday morning to find him in the backyard lying dead without a mark, like so many rabbits before him. I can count the number of times I ever saw my father cry on one hand. That was one of them. That was also when we found out how she killed so cleanly. She strangled her prey, like a jaguar. The fur at her father's neck was still wet with her saliva. We spent that morning burying that good old faithful dog, and then he sent me and my mom away on some pretense. No words were spoken, but there was no doubt about what he intended to do. I'm sure that there are some of you reading this that will find the notion of putting an animal down to be abominable. But what other options did he have, really? Take her to an animal shelter? Give her to some other family? Who could do that and go to sleep with a clear conscience? As it turned out, we weren't getting any sleep that night regardless of our decision. We spent that afternoon at my uncle's house. Once, when I came in from playing to get a glass of water, I overheard my mom telling my uncle that she sometimes wondered if the dog was possessed or something. I'd sometimes wondered the same thing. Later that evening, not long before sunset, we got a call from Dad. Apparently, the deed was done. By the time we arrived home, he'd already washed up and changed clothes, but there was little he could have done to hide his wounds, even less to hide the haunted look in his eyes. Both his arms and one leg were bandaged, and that was bad enough. But what stuck with me all these years later was just how terrified he looked. It wasn't until I'd actually been through combat that I recognized that expression. It's how men look after they've stared death straight in the face. My father never talked about it, but he drafted a friend from up the street to come help, and it's from him that I get this part of the story. Princess was many things, bloodthirsty and evil chief among them, but stupid wasn't among them. In that, if nothing else, she took after her father. Her dad, Rocky, was famous for letting himself into the house if it was storming out. He'd figured out how to paw open the sliding glass door out to the patio. What was really astounding is that he also had the presence of mind to close it behind him. Not being stupid, she knew something was up and made herself scarce, disappearing into the woods. Dad, not wanting to put this off and being in full-on revenge mode, called his friend from down the road and filled him in. So off on the hunt, the two of them went. In his own words, she was laying for us. If it sounds absurd to say that Princess lay in ambush, then I've failed at conveying just how wrong everything about her truly was. She led them on a chase through those woods, barking whenever it seemed the stupid humans had lost her again. Then she laid up beneath an overhang on the creek bank, just where the path crossed it, and she waited. She was on my father the instant he stepped down into the creek, grabbing his leg and making him fall headfirst into the water. Then she went straight for his throat. My dad had already lost his rifle at this point, and he grabbed her with both hands to try to fend her off, wrestling with 115 pounds of teeth, claws, and muscle, in 1.5 foot of water, Princess savaging his arms all the while. At some point, he managed to work his legs up between him and the dog and kick her away from him, providing his friend with a clean shot, which he took, catching Princess through the chest. He put a second round through her head. He then helped my dad back home and to the emergency room, telling him he'd go back to see after Princess once they got home. "She can rot where she is," was all my dad had to say on the subject. After they got back from the hospital, our neighbor went back on his ATV to pick up Princess for burial. He was a dog lover like us, and it just didn't seem right to him to leave her. If he'd spent as much time tiptoeing around as we had, he might have felt differently. "She flat wasn't there," he said. "No blood trail. Nothing." He also said that after he'd been there poking around for a few minutes, he noticed something else strange. No birds. It was dead quiet. The way the woods sometimes get right before a bad storm blows in. Wisely, he got right the hell out of there. There was a storm coming, all right. That night, Duchess came pawing at the back door wanting in, something she'd never once done in all the time she'd been with us. And I had a dream. In my dream, I was playing football in the backyard with some buddies, and ran over to where a bad throw had landed near Rocky's grave. As I reached for it, Princess's head shoved up out of the ground to grab my hand. I woke up with a jolt and was promptly scared out of roughly 10 more years of my life by the silhouette of a German shepherd in the hallway. It was Duchess, of course. She was sitting in the hallway, whining and wagging her tail nervously. She was looking back towards the front of the house. I walked over to her and placed my hand on her big doggy head and said, "What is it, girl?" That's when I heard the distinctive sound of claws on glass. Something was pawing at the patio door. Thoroughly terrified, I grabbed Duchess by the collar and dragged her along with me to my parents' room, shutting the door behind me. I was 14, I was terrified. But even in that terror, retreating to my parents' room wasn't just for the security of Mommy and Daddy. That's where the guns were. I woke them up and told them what I'd heard. Dad got up and locked the bedroom door and said, "Y'all lock yourselves in the bathroom." I heard the patio door slide open. If any of the rest of us had any doubts about what had just come into the house, Duchess sure didn't. The only thing she'd ever feared in this world was her own pup. A deep rumble of a growl vibrated in the floor beneath our bare feet, and Duchess's bladder let go as if on cue. Mine wasn't far from doing the same. What followed was a 6-hour exercise in pure terror, punctuated by snarling attacks on the bedroom door, crashes through the rest of the house as Princess found more things to break, whispered prayers from my mother, and litanies of curses from my father as another of his attempted forays out of the bedroom was thwarted. We were without a phone. The one on my parents' nightstand was dead. We'd later find the phone line to have been ripped out at the main box. My mom suggested that we try to make it to the car, and above and beyond everything else, it was my father's response to the idea that really scared me. Of the three of us, he was supposed to be the rational thinker, but what we got instead was, "Honey, I think that's what it wants us to do." As the world through the windows turned from black to gray, a quiet fell over the house. Mom and I watched through the windows, craning our heads in an attempt to get an eye on the patio door. But try as we might, the best we could manage was a view of most of the patio. More than enough concealment for a dog to slink in or out, even a big one like Princess. After an hour of silence, my dad quietly opened the bedroom door. I remember thinking what a useless gesture any attempt at stealth was. Dog senses are so much more acute than ours that we might as well have fired a 21-gun salute. Dad stopped in the hallway and shooed me back to the bedroom. "Don't come out until I say." Carefully, he made his way through the house to the patio door. We heard him shut it before he shouted back to us to stay in the bedroom till he told us to come out. Through the door, I could hear him moving around, and what seemed to be him dropping things into a garbage bag. After about 30 minutes, he gave us the all clear. What greeted us was a disaster. Ripped up cushions and pillows, destroyed furniture, shredded papers and books all over the floor. But most terrible were the smears of gore all over everything. My mother wondered aloud at what she drug into the house. Grim-faced, my father didn't answer. He simply turned and headed out the back to bury Rocky for a second time. We cleaned up as best we could while Dad drove down to our neighbor's house to make all the appropriate calls. After all these years, I still wonder what portion of homeowner's insurance covers attack by undead demon ghost dog. Unspoken, we all wondered what the night would bring. As it turned out, we never got a repeat, but Duchess never left the house again. Time rolled on. Occasionally, we'd find a new present on the rabbit bush. Just a friendly reminder, another token of Princess's abiding love. About 2 years into college, my dad called to tell me that our neighbor had passed away. "Heart attack in his sleep, the coroner says," said my dad. But what we were both thinking was, not a mark. There are plenty of nights where I wonder what the last thing was to pass before that old bachelor's eyes. I can guarantee you it stared right back. I've seen firsthand how it feeds. Not long after that, my folks put the house up for sale. I sort of acted as go-between on that deal. About a week after the new owners moved in, I received a call from the man of the house. He wanted to know if we'd left any pets behind when we moved. Already fearing the answer, I asked him why he asked. "Oh, me and the kids keep seeing this white shepherd in the woods. Pretty." Pretty. I was a child when I first got my dog, Paws. My father was away on a business trip. He went on a lot of those, and somehow I convinced my mother to get a dog. We went together to the pound, and there he was. This pathetic-looking thing huddled in the corner by the concrete walls. He reminded me of myself. I didn't have a lot of friends, and I kind of felt like he looked. Weak. Sad. Well, he waddled over to me, licked my face, and that was that. He was my best friend. Well, nothing happened for about a year as Paws grew up. He turned into a rather strong-looking dog, a big change from him being this pathetic thing slumped over in the corner. A year after I brought him home from the pound, I heard a knock on the door. Walking over, I saw an old, harmless-looking man with gray hair smiling through the glass. I smiled back, opened the door, and before I could even say hello, Paws leapt onto him and bit deep into his face. I tried to get him off, but he just kept tearing away at the old man's flesh. We lived in the city, and a police officer happened to be patrolling nearby and hear the commotion. He took out his gun to shoot Paws, but I screamed and leapt in front of him, shielding him from the officer. The policeman yelled at me to get out of the way, but I love that dog. The officer kicked Paws off the old man, and my dog cried out in pain. Then, something strange happened. As the officer knelt down to help the old man up, we saw something on the ground next to him. A human ear. The policeman and I just stared at the ear. Then we both looked at the same time back up at the old man. Had Paws torn his ear off? But no. The old man, though bloodied, sure enough had 2 ears. The officer and I stared at each other, both a little confused, and that's when the old man took off, running down the driveway. I watched as the police officer paused for a few moments, then put 2 and 2 together. Something wasn't right here. He chased down the old man and pinned him up against the wall, cuffing his hands and calling for backup. It wasn't until a week later on the news I found out that that old man had been collecting the body parts of little boys. He was indeed a monster. There were 2 other occasions as well, one when I was a little older. I would walk Paws in a park near our home. The funny thing was this park was packed with people, so you'd think it would be safe. Well, every time I would take him, there was a beautiful older woman just sitting on a bench on the far edge of the park. She looked a bit out of place, but she seemed harmless, as she would smile and say hello. From the first time Paws saw her, sitting on that bench, He lowered his head and growled deeply. I figured it was nothing. The last time he had growled had been the old man, but this just must be a coincidence, right? Well, I was wrong. The next day in the park, the woman was nowhere to be seen, and Paws ran over to the bench where she would sit and began to dig. I tried to stop him, but before I could, I saw a bone. It looked human. He kept on digging, and the police were called. A few days later, again on the news, it turns out that that beautiful woman had murdered her husband and 2 children last summer, burying them in plain sight, right in the park. Well, many years have passed, and Paws is older now. 13, actually. He doesn't walk as well as he used to. He can barely see anymore, and his eyes are cloudy, as if a mist is covering them more and more. I can barely stand the thought of losing my best friend. Well, I met Colleen about 5 months ago, and she is everything I could ever want. Smart, beautiful, kind, loyal. She's wonderful. She even volunteers at a home for sick children who are dying. She stays with them as they go through their last moments. It's amazing the type of woman that she is. I'm so lucky. Well, I had just proposed the week earlier and couldn't wait to introduce her to my parents. And, of course, Paws. We flew across the country, holding hands the whole time on the plane flight like we were teenagers. When we got there, we got in a cab and headed over to my parents' home. Opening the door, my mother smiled and instantly gave Colleen a hug. My father walked over behind her, smiling as well, and told her welcome to the family. John has said such wonderful things about you. I asked about Paws, and they said nothing. Knowing how much I loved my dog, they were dreading telling me the news. They had taken him to the doctor, and he would have to be put to sleep in the morning. The doctor had nodded when they explained how much I loved Paws, and that they wanted him to pass away at his home. He was in the other room, laying on a blanket and sleeping. He couldn't walk anymore, and hadn't opened his eyes for a couple days. Colleen gave me a hug, as she knew how much he meant to me. Fighting back tears, I nodded to my parents and walked with Colleen into the guest bedroom, where my best friend was laying down. I put my hand on his back and put my forehead against his. His eyes were closed, but as I continued to talk to him, he slowly opened his eyes. Barely able to move, his tail started to wag slowly, and he dug his head into my chest. And we both just sat there, together. My protector. It was then I heard footsteps behind me, and remembered that Colleen was here too. I had forgotten all about her. Paws turned his head and looked at Colleen through his cloudy eyes.
I used to look out the rusted iron bars of my window and dream about being a bird, The chain that shackled me to my bed was just long enough to reach the windowsill, and so every night after my father would visit my room, I would lie awake and wait for the first rays of light to creep over the horizon, then walk over to my window and listen to the morning's first few notes of birdsong. Their melodies were so beautiful. I knew that they must have been singing about places far away and wonderful, about sailing on the wind through endless blue skies, looking down at the treetops that dotted the land below. Then, one morning as I lay in bed, something impossible happened. I had fallen asleep the night before and would have missed my morning birdsong but for a tapping on my window. I rubbed the sleep out of my eyes and sat up to see a crow sitting outside on the sill, tapping my window with his beak. I crept over to the window and smiled at the bird. "Hello, Mr. Crow," I said. "Hello, little girl," said the crow. I stood there dumbfounded for a moment, not knowing what to say. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I forced myself to speak. "You know how to talk?" I said. "All birds know how to talk," he replied. "It's just that not all humans know how to listen." I pushed my window open a crack until it hit against the bars. The bird cocked its head in curiosity. "Why are you in a cage?" it asked. "I think it's my destiny," I said. "It's always been this way." "You look rather thin," replied the crow. "Would you like something to eat?" My stomach gave a weak growl. "Yes," I said. "That would be wonderful." Without another word, the crow took flight. A few minutes later, he returned with a small branch of figs. The crow watched me as I greedily devoured the fruit. After I had finished, he stared at me for a moment before speaking again. "I didn't know they put people in cages," he said. "Do you think they mistook you for a bird?" "I don't think so, Mr. Crow," I said. We spent the rest of the day talking. The crow told me all about what it was like to fly, how there was no better feeling in the world. He told me about the faraway lands he had visited when he was a young bird and could still make the journey north with the changing of the seasons. Finally, evening came and the crow said that he had to go. The next morning he was back, however, with 2 more branches of figs. I thanked him for his generosity, and we talked another day away. That day he even sang me a song. He didn't have a voice for singing, but I thought his song was beautiful anyway. We passed the entire fall that way, and the bird's visits became the only bright spot in my life. He brought me not only figs, but cherries and walnuts too, anything small enough for him to carry. Soon, however, winter came, and with it the frost that destroyed the figs and cherries that the crow had used to bring me. His gifts became fewer and fewer, and I could tell from his tired voice that he was flying farther and farther away to get them. One morning, when the first snows of winter had fallen, the crow asked me a question. "What would you do to leave this place?" he asked, cocking his head to the side. I thought for a moment, but I wasn't sure how to answer. Finally, I told the truth. "I would do anything to leave this place," I said. "Anything at all." The crow solemnly nodded and said, "The frost isn't the only thing that winter brings." He flapped his eyes once and jumped from the windowsill, and I didn't see him for 3 days. I began to fall into a deep depression. Every morning I would still listen to the birdsong, but it sounded empty without my friend there to listen with me. The morning after the 3rd day, my crow friend returned. It was so beautiful that day. The sun had come out from behind the clouds to melt the snow, One of the last green days before winter came in earnest. As the shadow passed over the valley in which we lived, I first mistook it for a storm cloud, but then I heard the sound. It was loud enough to crack the sky, but it wasn't thunder. It was birds. Thousands upon thousands of them descended on our house. A whirling storm of beating wings and shrieking caws, they crashed into the walls and windows, pecking at them with wild ferocity. The house shook under their assault, and their calls were so loud that I didn't even hear the windows breaking. They were not so loud, however, that I could not hear my father scream. It was over in a matter of minutes, and the key to my shackles slipped under the door. I rushed over and picked it up with trembling hands, sliding it into the metal cuff around my ankle and turning it. The cuff came loose with a heavy click, and for the first time I was free. The key to the door slipped under the jamb as well, and I opened the door to the rest of the house. The place had been all but destroyed. There was splintered wood and broken glass everywhere, and in the center of the living room was what remained of my father, a pile of blood-stained feathers. The birds had all flown off, but Mr. Crow sat on top of the living room fireplace, regarding me with a curious look. "Now you can fly free, little girl," he said. "No more cages for you." "Thank you, Mr. Crow," I said. "Will you come with me?" Mr. Crow shook his head. "I am an old bird," he said, "and my journey is coming to a close. But yours is just beginning." Mr. Crow flapped his wings and took flight, and I never saw him again. As I stepped out of the front door, my bare feet touched the grass for the very first time, and I could smell the flowers on the breeze as it drifted over me. At that moment, though my feet were firmly on the ground, my heart was soaring through endless blue sky, far above the world that I had left behind. I still wake up every morning to hear the birds sing, and when the first few notes break the silence of early dawn, I think of Mr. Crow and smile.